Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 241 Xiang Feng. As Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui walked through the streets on the west side of the camp, the number of things they saw expanded both of their knowledge of what humans would be willing to do in starvation situations. Some women with a bit of makeup and clothing in poor condition were even working as prostitutes and trying to attract some customers. The price could range from a piece of stale bread and a compressed rice cracker to a packet of instant noodles, depending on how clean and how pretty the girl was. As for the men, their fates could only be miserable and starving. Without work, they had no way to make a living. After turning a corner, Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui were about to continue when a weak but anxious voice stopped them. "Sir, please wait a moment." Looking over to the side of the dirt road, they both saw a woman in her late 30s to early 40s sitting on the ground. Her age was difficult to decipher at this point, as her face was covered in dirt and her loose clothing made it almost impossible to tell the real approximate of her age with any accuracy. Next to the woman was a girl of about 10 years old. Her black hair reached to her shoulders, but like her face, it was covered with dirt and dust. Her clothing consisted mostly of torn pants and a large sheet wrapped around her small body, as well as a pair of different colored shoes. Bai Zemin was about to ignore the woman, but seeing the innocent, pure, but weak look in the little girl's eyes, his heart that was shielded by an invisible armor of stone could not help but be moved, so he stopped his steps. On the way they had seen no less than a dozen hungry children. However, at this moment, Bai Zemin could do nothing about it. Although he was strong, he did not have the power to handle everything and solve all the problems. The only thing he could do was to hope that these children could endure a little longer. When he took over this whole base and began to apply his own rules, the miserable situation of those who were weak because life had not given them enough time to grow up would be different. At the very least, they would not have to worry about having a bowl of food. Seeing them stop, the woman's eyes glittered and she said hurriedly, "Please buy me and my daughter. Just 2 packets of instant noodles and mother and daughter will serve you one night." Bai Zemin's expression sank completely when he heard the woman's words. Even the usually indifferent Shangguan Bingshui had a noticeable change in her covert expression. "You. What did you say?" Bai Zemin gritted his teeth and said with difficulty. He looked at the little girl and realized that although she was frightened, she did not refute her mother. You sell your little daughter?" Shangguan Bingshui also couldn't seem to believe what she was hearing, so she asked again, as if she wanted to make sure her head was wrong because she didn't want to believe the words that came out of the woman's mouth in front of her. As if realizing the anger coming from the people in front of her, the woman hesitated on what to say next. A look of heartbreaking pain shone in her eyes and tears began to fall down her face as she said in a choked voice, My daughter and I. We have not eaten properly. For over 2 weeks. Only a person who had experienced hunger would be able to understand how terrifying that feeling was. When your body itself begins to devour you alive as your flesh slowly begins to be swallowed by the blood in search of nutrients to survive. The pain of having an empty stomach was not something anyone could endure, and even the bravest soldiers would bow down to such a feeling as the days went by. It was just that Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui had never experienced the feeling of starvation. As people who risked their lives from the first second, in reward for their efforts, they gained enough strength to at least be able to feed themselves well. Therefore, none of them could really understand how hard this woman was battling. In fact, Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui did not know that this was the first time the mother did something like this. She had no choice but to do what she was doing. If she sold herself, with her average appearance and how weak she was, she would not be able to attract any customers. However, there were plenty of perverts in the world, and the desire to have a mother and daughter pair in the same bed was enough to tempt a beast. "If I don't do it, my daughter will starve to death," the woman cried disconsolately. Seeing her mother crying, the little girl crawled over and hugged her with her small hands as if she wanted to show her support. However, the girl's action only made the pain in the mother's heart increase even more. Bai Zemin, who was about to slap the woman in front of him, finally calmed down a little after hearing the woman's words. Shangguan Bingshui also realized that neither she nor anyone else who had not gone through something similar could understand the woman's feelings in front of her. Most of her earlier anger turned to sadness, and her blue eyes flashed as if she had made up her mind. what right do I have to judge? Bai Zemin scolded himself and took a deep breath to self-calm himself. He looked at the mother-daughter pair and said in an indifferent tone, 2 packets of instant noodles for one night is not enough. From now on, you and this girl will follow me, and in return I will feed you both. If you are willing then fine, if not then forget it and let's pretend we didn't meet each other today. After saying this, Bai Zemin put his bag on the ground and opened it, revealing the stuff inside. Seeing the vast bags of white rice and the large amount of food inside the bag, the woman's eyes glittered with greed and the little girl swallowed heavily. Except for the relief food distributed once a day by the base government, mother and daughter had not eaten anything else. Therefore, this was the first time in a long time that they had seen a large amount of food. The girl's mother was so overwhelmed for a moment that she didn't know what to say. For a person to have all that food, he definitely had to be a high official of the base or a powerful warrior. So why would someone like that want to take 2 weak and defenseless women like them? At the end of the day, the woman knew that except for her body, she was nothing more than a burden in the present world. The only one who understood that this was Bai Zemin's way of helping the mother and daughter duo was Shangguan Bingshui. Her blue eyes trembled faintly and the way she looked at him changed slightly. Although she already knew that he was not a tyrant and that he really cared for people who somehow deserved it, this was the first time she had seen him perform an act of kindness. Even if he acted and spoke indifferently, it was clear to her that he really cared about the 2 people in front of them, at least for the little girl. As for why Bai Zemin wanted to take the mother along as well, Shangguan Bingshui knew indistinctly that it was so as not to separate the little girl from her mother. In order for the mother to understand Bai Zemin's intention and to ease the worries in the heart of this woman who had suffered enough, Shangguan Bingshui revealed her face for a few seconds. Although she usually did not care too much, she knew that she was a beautiful woman and, in this case, for the first time, her beauty was not a handicap but a support. Seeing the practically heavenly appearance of the young woman in front of her, the mother was momentarily stunned. Soon, however, her eyes lit up and she no longer hesitated. I am willing. My daughter and I are willing to follow you, sir. As long as you feed us both, no matter what you want us to do, our lives are yours. With such a charming and beautiful woman in his company, the young man in front of her had no reason to target an average woman like her or her daughter who had not even fully matured. Besides, this young man did not seem to be a pervert, and he had plenty of supplies with him. The girl's mother knew that this might be the only chance life presented to her and her daughter to not die in a corner, so she was determined to hold on to this opportunity with all her heart. Seeing the woman accept, Shangguan Bingshui sighed in relief and covered her face again. She knew that while Bai Zemin might have been willing to give in this time, if the woman refused his offer then he would definitely have turned away without giving second chances. Bai Zemin nodded as he heard the woman accept his offer. Indeed, Shangguan Bingshui's thoughts were 100% correct, and if the woman rejected his offer he would have turned around and left without hesitation. What is your name? He asked calmly. My name is Yifeng and my daughter's name is Xiangfeng. The mother, Yifeng, responded hurriedly. She tried to stand up abruptly, but she was so weak that she lost her balance instead. Just as she was about to fall, Bai Zemin grabbed her by the arm and steadied her. His expression didn't change despite the woman's foul smell, and instead he took some things out of his bag. For now, eat this. You can have something better when we finish settling some matters. He said as he handed the mother and daughter duo 2 big rice crackers and 2 milk cartons, one for each. Seeing the rice crackers and milk cartons, Yifeng's and Xiangfeng's eyes glittered with desire. When was the last time they had seen anything other than relief food? Almost a whole month. As for comfort food such as milk, those were luxuries they could only dream of but never touch. Yifeng took the food that had been given to her and began to eat cautiously while looking at the 2 people in front of her without wanting to make any offense. She knew that her fate would be good if she followed these 2, but miserable if she made them angry. As for little 10-year-old Xiangfeng, she was just a little girl without too many complex thoughts in her pure and childish mind. She just took a small bite of the cookie in her hands as if she wanted to make it last as long as possible while using her 2 big eyes to look at the young man who had given her tasty food with curiosity. Let's go. Bai Zemin gave the girl a glance and hesitated for a moment before ordering in a calm voice. Yifang and Xiangfeng followed in the footsteps of Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui under the envious eyes of other survivors. Although this particular corner was practically empty, there were still 3 or 4 other people besides the mother and daughter duo. When they saw Yifang and Xiangfeng eating and drinking milk, they were all filled with envy. However, none of them dared to try to fight to snatch their food. To begin with, if they were brave people in the first place, they would not be in this situation and would have already become soul evolvers or died in the mouth of some zombie or mutated beast. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 242 Mother-Daughter Difficulties. Along the way, Shangguan Bingshui surprisingly seemed to be very empathetic to the situation of Yifang and her young daughter Xiangfeng. She, who was usually cold as ice, suddenly seemed to turn into another person. This secretly surprised Bai Zemin very much. After all, it was the first time he had seen this ice woman act like that. Even when Wu Yijuan, who was her childhood friend, was trapped in the female dormitory and her life or death was unknown, she did not show such an amount of care. Perhaps, thanks to her beauty acting as a kind of buffer or confidence booster, Yifang did not have too many barriers and neither did she have too many wariness towards the beautiful Shangguan Bingshui. After talking for a couple of minutes, the woman slowly narrated the story of how she and her daughter ended up in such a precarious situation. In the past, Yifang had married with a good and family-oriented man. Her husband, the father of little Xiangfeng, was not a wealthy person, but he worked hard every day to take care of his family, and the relationship between the 3 of them was quite good even if there were sometimes disagreements, as was the case with most couples in the world. Unfortunately, after about 15 years of marriage, little Xiangfeng's father passed away. More specifically, this happened a month ago, just when the soul record showed up in the lives of all living beings on Earth without being invited and when the mana that had just awakened caused the apocalypse. To protect the 2 most important women in his life, Yifang's husband killed several zombies along the way in order to make a path out of the apartment they lived in with his own hands. With his efforts, he even managed to become a level 5 soul evolver in a very short time. Sadly, the man had been scratched by a zombie in order to protect his daughter. And as with any soul evolver infected by the zombie's vicious mana, the man naturally began to lose his rationality little by little. Before he lost his mind and his body did not belong to him anymore, the man said goodbye to his family, and under the pain-filled gaze of the mother-daughter pair, he went into a forest to never be seen again. Fortunately, after hiding in the basement of a small house for 2 days, the mother and daughter duo were found and rescued by a couple of Tinyuan town police officers and then relocated in the current base that was just beginning to take shape. During the first week, Yifang had worked really hard. Whether it was breaking her hands lifting objects twice her body weight or cleaning the houses of some government officials, she was willing to stay up all night just to bring some food to her daughter. Unfortunately, such a situation did not last for a long time. The house where she worked belonged to a pervert with a not very nice record within the base. One day, Yifang saw with her own eyes how the pervert forced himself on another maid and, fearing for her own safety, she did not go back to that place. As if the aforementioned was not enough, food soon became scarce and the work of reinforcing the walls had to stop as there was not enough food to pay the workers. It was then that the plight of the mother and daughter duo began in earnest. To this day, mother and daughter had survived only by eating the relief gruel that the government prepared once per day for the survivors. However, the human body could not survive by eating only gruel endlessly, let alone with only 1 bowl a day. After about 3 weeks, Yifang noticed that her daughter Xiangfeng's health began to deteriorate more and more. Being at the age of full growth, Xiangfeng needed a lot of nutrients to keep up with her body's progress. Therefore, Yifang, with a heart filled with sadness and sorrow, tried to sell her body to feed her daughter. Fortunately or not, Yifang did not manage to sleep with any man besides her deceased husband. This made her extremely happy as she could still remain faithful to the love of her life even in death, but at the same time, it made her extremely anxious as her skin gradually began to turn more and more yellow while her not-so-outstanding beauty began to fade. At her wit's end and seeing that her daughter couldn't even make it through another week with the situation they were in, Yifang finally opted to do what no mother wanted to do. She simply had no choice. If she could go kill zombies, she would gladly do so. But, killing zombies now was no longer so easy compared to a month ago. Besides, if she died, her 10-year-old daughter would be left alone in this desolate world and would definitely die, or worse, she could become the plaything of a pervert before being killed silently inside the darkness of some alley on the west side of the base. I guess the gods finally took pity on us, mother and daughter. Xietain muttered in a weak voice amidst almost inaudible sobs of bitterness that were a mixture of joy and sadness. If it weren't for Mr. and Miss. I'm afraid Xietain and I would already. The gods? Xietain unconsciously sneered. Putting aside whether the gods are as venerable and all-powerful as we thought, do you really think that if the gods were kind, mankind and the rest of the races would be in this kind of situation? Since he learned from Lilith the truth about the gods and demons, Xietain trusted no one but himself. Miracles could only be achieved by oneself, and expecting outside help would only end up killing you someday. This was the law by which the current Xietain was governed. Shangguan Bing Shui looked at Xietain with her face still covered. Her blue eyes had a strange glint in them as she clearly noticed the ridicule of the young man who walked shoulder to shoulder with her when he mentioned about the gods. Xietain didn't know what to say either, so she just lowered her head in silence, not daring to speak too much for fear of being kicked into the cold street once again. When he sensed the woman's discomfort behind him, Xietain softened his tone and said calmly, "You can call me Xietain. No need to use the word Mr. when it's just us around." "Oh, okay." Xietain nodded somewhat hesitantly. Xietain suddenly felt his sleeve being pulled and stopped his steps as he looked behind him. What he saw were two big bright eyes looking at him like those of a small kitten that was bullied, and his heart was slightly shaken. "Big brother, Xietain is hungry. This little brat." Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard the pity-filled voice of the little girl behind him. Could it be that all girls were as innocent as Luoning and Xietain? He shook his head before crouching down and gently patting the girl's messy hair. "Xietain, be good and hold on a little longer. Big brother will give you something good later, but you can't eat too much now or your stomach will start to hurt." Xietain had been starving for a long time, so Xietain needed to give her food little by little so that her stomach would widen enough to keep up with her appetite. Otherwise, it would only end up causing more harm than good. The girl seemed to understand, but at the same time she didn't seem to understand at all. Still, she nodded wisely and stopped insisting. Although she was a young girl of only 10 years old, she had gone through many hardships during the past month and had seen her mother experience many hard things. Xietain, who was only 10 years old, knew when to move forward and when to move backward as if she were an adult. For better or worse, today's world forced this formerly innocent child to mature a little faster than she really should. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 243 Trade. Just as the group of 4 was about to leave the western area to go deeper into the center of the base and finally reach the east, several bells began to clang noisily all over the place. The noise was conspicuous enough to be heard from a fairly considerable distance. "What is that?" Xietain frowned slightly. He realized that those bells were cleverly placed so that every certain amount of distance there was one to amplify the sound. "That. The sound of that bell means that the government is starting to distribute the relief rations for today." Xietain replied in a complicated tone of voice. "Oh?" Xietain secretly glanced at Xietain to see what the girl's reaction was. The girl's big pure eyes glittered with hunger and desire as the sound of the bell spread everywhere. In addition, Xietain also noticed how she unconsciously swallowed the saliva accumulated inside her mouth as if she was imagining the taste of the food. How hungry did this girl have to be to even desire some gruel to such a degree? Xietain couldn't help but feel bad. Only now was he beginning to really understand a little of the hardships this mother and daughter pair had gone through, and he finally began to sympathize with Xietan's actions. "Come on. Let's go see what these rations are like." A thought flashed in his mind, and without hesitation he began to walk in the direction of the nearest bell. With Shangguan Bing Shui at his side, Xietain and Xietain walked a step or two back from both of them. As they walked through the streets, a large number of survivors were rushing from everywhere, with this place as the central gathering point. Xietain also saw many other survivors farther away hurrying to other bells. The look in the eyes of those survivors was similar to that of a wild tiger or a hyena that had not eaten for several weeks and finally found a wounded and lonely gazelle in the savannah. After 2 or 3 minutes, the group of 4 finally arrived at a large open square in the open air with a few stands set up along various points. Behind each wooden table were 2 people who were delivering the relief food. The survivors were in complete disarray. There wasn't even a single line, and the situation was a mess. It looked like it would only be a short time before they would start beating each other to death to get through first and get their portion. Seeing this, Xietain frowned slightly, but remembering that this was not his place, he said nothing. If this was his base, a situation like this would definitely not happen. In the past, some survivors would try to cut the line, but since some of them received 2 or 3 lashes as a reprimand, no one else dared to break the line or cause a disturbance. This measure also served to avoid unnecessary injuries and even deaths, since being trampled by a stampede of desperate humans was nothing to scoff at. Xietain pulled little Xiangfeng closer, while Shangguan Bingshui pulled Yifang closer. With the efforts of 2 powerful high-level first-order soul evolvers, the group of 4 people advanced slowly amidst the survivors until they finally arrived at the front after a bit of effort. A fat man of around 26 or 27 was holding a large spoon as he stood next to a pot. When a survivor approached with their bowl or any other recipient, the fat man would take the contents inside the pot and casually throw it into the recipient in the hands of the survivors before moving on to the next one. Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui moved a little closer and saw the contents inside the pot. To say that what was inside the pot was gruel would be disrespectful to the gruel. Basically, there was nothing but white water in there. It would be more correct to say that instead of gruel, the contents inside the pots were actually a heap of rice soup where water dominated 99%. This is what people eat here? Isn't that just water? Shangguan Bingshui could not stop her melodious voice from escaping her lips. She had supervised the relief food distribution in Beginning Village several times, so she knew very well what kind of food the survivors ate. Even those slackers and vivid ones could eat 3 bowls containing 60% water and 40% rice. But the people in the North Camp had to survive by eating a daily bowl of rice soup? Shangguan Bingshui really did not understand how this base had not yet suffered a mutiny. Hearing someone complain, the fat man raised his head and looked at her as he sneered, "If you don't want to eat, then just go away, woman. Wait until you're hungry for several days, and then I assure you that you'll come crawling on your hands and knees begging for some food. A dirty woman like you probably can't even sell her body to get a piece of bread, ha ha ha." Although Shangguan Bingshui was a great beauty, her face was completely covered and her body was covered with a large cloak that had some dirt stains, so her seductive curves were also not visible. When she heard the fat man's sneering tone and offensive words, Shangguan Bingshui's body trembled slightly and a chill flashed through her pupils for an instant. This was the first time in her life that anyone had dared to say such words to her, let alone after she had become the second leader of a survivor camp only below Xietain in terms of power and authority. If it wasn't for her self-control, this fat wretch would have turned into an ice statue by now and wouldn't even know how he died. Xietain's group stepped back and watched as the other survivors were given bowls of gruel that were actually practically water, and they all licked their bowls clean. Then they turned to look at the large pot of gruel with greedy eyes. "Although it's not much. This daily bowl of food is all we have," Yifang said bitterly as her eyes glittered with pain. "This bowl may not mean much to you too, but to people like us who are at the bottom of the bottom, it represents our only hope of living another day. Let's go." Xietain shook his head and took Xiangfeng with him. Shangguan Bingshui gave the fat man one last look as if hesitating about something, but in the end shook her head and took Yifang away to leave the crowd. Seconds later, the group of 4 disappeared into the large mass of people, and none of them noticed and probably would never know that among them were people with so much power, while someone managed to keep his little life after offending someone he really shouldn't have. 30 minutes later, the group finally reached another part of the camp. As they moved on and away from the west, the survivors' complexions gradually improved. However, they all still looked hungry, and some were so weak that they could not even move properly. There were also several other gathering points where relief food was being distributed. "This is number 4 Street," Yifang indicated as she pointed ahead. "This is where survivors gather to sell their belongings, things that are of no use to them, or simply out of necessity. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui looked around curiously. There were many stores of all kinds, with a variety of items for sale. The better stores had a few tables set up, while in other cases it was just a large sheet lying on the floor with the items for sale lying onto it. As they slowly walked through the busy streets, Bai Zemin suddenly saw a store of interest to him and approached the salesman. Seeing someone approaching his stall, the vendor immediately brightened up. "This little brother, in my store you can find everything, from clothes for hot days to woolen clothes for cold days. With the temperatures getting stranger and stranger even after the weather stabilized a bit, it's best to always be prepared." Bai Zemin gave him a sidelong glance. The salesman was small and thin. His eyes sunk inward and his eyebrows were barely visible, while his nose was similar to that of an eagle but at the same time that of a pig. He looked quite strange, and the greedy light that constantly flashed in his eyes made people not have a good first impression of him. "Boss, how much for these 2 wool sweaters and these short-sleeved children's t-shirts? Besides, if the price satisfies me, I'll also take some little girls' underwear and pants." Bai Zemin didn't want to linger too long, so he cut to the chase as he squatted down next to the stands. The seller rubbed his hands when he saw the big backpack on Bai Zemin's back, each woolen sweater for 2 packs of instant noodles or half a kilo of white rice. Each short-sleeved t-shirt for 1 package of instant noodles or 300 grams of white rice. Underwear for 150 grams of white rice. As for pants, 3 packets of instant noodles or 1 kilogram of white rice. Bai Zemin stood up and looked at the street seller coldly. "I will give you 4 packets of instant noodles for the girls' clothes and 4 more for the same number for adult women's clothes. If you accept, we can make the deal now. If not, then you can keep your clothes." How could the small acts of a peddler go unnoticed from Bai Zemin's eyes? This man's prices were basically daylight robbery. Too bad for the peddler. Bai Zemin already had his fair share of poverty to know what was good and what was bad, so it wasn't easy to fool him. The seller gritted his teeth and hesitated. He was sure that the young man in front of him had plenty of supplies, but if he really left without buying anything, then it would be a big loss for him. So far, he hadn't managed to sell anything, and if he couldn't sell off the annoying clothes, then he would have to starve. Seeing that the customer was about to leave, the salesman quickly yelled, "Little brother, wait. I'll sell it to you. 8 packs of instant noodles for everything." Bai Zemin gave him one last glance before looking at Yifeng behind him and pointed, "Pick out the clothes for you and Xiang Feng." Yifeng hesitated for a moment and wanted to say that there was no need to waste precious food like that on a woman like her. However, she swallowed her words when she saw Bai Zemin's serious expression. After giving him a look filled with gratitude, the woman began to look at the clothes carefully as she took some clothes for her daughter first. 4 pants, 4 woolen sweaters, 4 short-sleeved t-shirts, 4 sets of underwear, 1 pack of instant noodles for 2 pairs of shoes and 2 pairs of socks. 1 for woman and 1 for child. Bai Zemin said as he looked at the man. The man smiled bitterly and realized that the young man in front of him was even more cunning than the foxes. In the end, he didn't want to haggle over the price for fear of losing such a big customer and nodded. Soon, Yifeng had finished choosing clothes for her daughter and herself. Her eyes filled with tears that threatened to fall at any moment as she looked at the 2 young people beside her. She had not known them long, but she could tell they were not bad people. The only thing she wanted most was for her little daughter to be able to live a little better. She never expected such a great gift from the heavens. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 244, The Value of Food. When Yifeng had finished picking out clothes for herself and Xiang Feng, Bai Zemin removed the backpack from his back and opened it to reveal its contents as he began to look for the agreed payment for the man in front of him. However, although he did this action without much thought, the surroundings became a bit agitated when the survivors saw the amount of supplies inside the bag. The amount of food that Bai Zemin brought was simply too much after all. This was the first time these survivors had seen so much food since the apocalypse broke out. Although people began to mutter to each other while pointing fingers, none of them stepped forward to cause trouble. A person with so many supplies was definitely not someone ordinary inside the base. All of these survivors had already understood that if they angered someone powerful, they would simply end up dying worse than cats and dogs. In fact, finding bodies lying in the gutters was often not a strange sight for these people. Many survivors who directly or indirectly offended people they shouldn't have were found lifeless the next day. Xietain naturally had his reasons for doing what he did. He ignored everyone's glares and took several packs of instant noodles. "This is the agreed payment," he said as he handed the packets to the small man. The salesman gulped audibly when he saw the amount of supplies inside the bag as he took the packages of instant noodles. In his mind, he was cursing the young man in front of him a million times. "You have so much food in there, but you're haggling a lot with a little shrimp like me? Have you no shame?" thought the man as he watched Xietain close his bag and carry it back to his back hanging over one of his shoulders. "Let's go," he said calmly with the intention of continuing to look around the stores at the edge of the street. He still had things he needed to buy. The 3 women of different ages, 2 grown and 1 petite, followed closely behind him. "Little brother, buy me something. Look over here. I'm sure you'll find something you like." "Just 2 packs of instant noodles for this smart TV, young man." Many salesmen who seemed desperate to get rid of what was no longer useful to them tried their best to attract Xieain's attention. Some shouted, others even left their stands to try to get noticed. However, he ignored them all and continued to advance forward while keeping his guard up. After all, this was the enemy's base and he had not come with good intentions in mind as well. About 2 streets ahead, Xietain finally found what he was looking for and stopped in front of a small stand. "Boss, how much do you want for these pots and bowls?" he asked as he picked up some cooking utensils and checked the condition they were in. The man appeared to be an honest man. He was short and somewhat plump, but his beard was unkempt and some fatigue could be seen in his eyes. However, he smiled slightly as he saw that he had a prospective customer. "Young man, the set of pots and a dozen bowls. In total, that would be 4 packages of instant noodles or half a kilogram of white rice." Food was the most sought-after thing these days. Survivors were willing to do basically anything for a bowl of food. 4 packets of instant noodles or half a kilogram of rice would be enough for this man to live without worrying about starving for a week if he tightened his stomach and didn't waste. Xietain did not answer right away and instead pointed to a small carafe with a small furnace sitting onto it after checking the weight. "How much for the small furnace?" Considering it is a good cooking tool and easy to carry in this chaotic world, the small furnace is worth 3 packets of instant noodles or 300 grams of white rice. The man hesitated for a moment before giving his price with an honest expression on his face. He looked at Xietain with some anxiety. After all, a total of 7 packets of instant noodles or 800 grams of white rice was not a small amount. Xietain thought about it for a moment and realized that the man's price was quite fair. In fact, if it were him, he would ask more for the small gas cooker. "We have a deal then." In the end, Xietain decided not to haggle over the price. He opened his bag and carefully observed the expression of the man in front of him. The salesman's eyes held surprise, envy, even a bit of bitterness. But not greed, which was extremely rare. The normal thing would be to be greedy for a bag stuffed with food. To help the man who seemed to be too good to live in this cruel and selfish world, Xietain took out a 1-kilogram sack of rice. "Just keep the rest. Consider it a gift from me." Xietain was quite simple. If anyone tried to take advantage from him, he would take care of tearing off a piece of their flesh. However, if they treated him honestly, then he was willing to be kind as well. The chubby man's eyes filled with tears and for a moment he didn't know what to say. With trembling hands, he took the sack of rice and wordlessly bowed deeply. With this amount of rice, he and his wife could eat for quite some time. If they diluted the rice a little to form a gruel, even eating for half a month was not impossible. Moreover, this gruel would be far better than the one given by the government as relief food, which basically had no rice at all and was pure water. Even when Xietain and the 3 women disappeared into the crowd of people, the man still remained bowed. It was after a full minute that he finally straightened his back, wiped away the tears of gratitude, and packed the few things he had left before going home. "Big brother, do you want to play with me? I was a high school student in the past and was among the 10 prettiest in my grade. Just a pack of instant noodles and I'll let you have fun for a whole night. Young man, how would you like to have some fun with a mature and experienced woman?" 2 packs, little brother. On the way back, Xieain's group passed by a place where there were many women in revealing clothes who tried to approach him while jiggling their flexible waists. Many of them could be considered beauties even if they were not on the same level as Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin. These women could not care less if there were already some women alongside the man. From their point of view, any man was a potential customer and they were willing to provide their services just to stop their stomachs from growling. Of course, Bai Zemin ignored them all and simply continued moving towards his destination. Yifang's expression was casual. She used to disdain such acts. But after being pushed into a corner, she finally understood that many times, people were forced to do things they were unwilling to do because of circumstances. Shangguan Bingshui had a complex look on her face as she watched all this. Some girls who offered their bodies were even much younger than her, too young to be doing such things. However, life was cruel. She didn't have the power to help everyone either. Unconsciously, she clenched her fists tightly and her blue eyes flashed with anger. While there were also some prostitutes in the beginning village, under the strict rules, all underage women were completely forbidden to sell their bodies, and if a man was found having sex with an underage girl, he would be decapitated in front of everyone as a warning. With the possibility of having a decent job and with 3 bowls of gruel every day even for the slackers, no one had the right to complain. However, in the North Camp, Shangguan Bingshui had seen that compared to the strict rules and Bai Zemin's cruelty, this place was a hell. From the beginning, she did not have much hope for the Chinese government, but her hopes only dimmed to minimum levels after all she saw today. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 245 Speed up the attack process. Approximately 30 to 40 minutes later, the group of 4 led by Bai Zemin finally returned to walk back into the small courtyard they had previously received when they first arrived at the base. When the survivors living in wooden huts saw the group walk into one of the few buildings in good condition of the area, envy and caution glittered in everyone's eyes. No one dared to cause any trouble and each survivor focused only on saving as much energy as possible. Oh. You're BA, Who is this lady and this little young lady? Nangong Yi looked towards the door expecting to see the duo of Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui return, but was surprised to see that there were 2 people who were not with them when they departed almost 2 hours ago. Bai Zemin walked to the kitchen and put down the cooking utensils he had bought earlier. Then, he returned to the room that was supposed to be the living room and calmly pointed, "The adult woman is Yifang. The little beauty next to her is named Xiang Feng. They are joining us from today." Yifang looked at the 2 people inside the room cautiously. She was secretly surprised to see such a beautiful woman together with a man around her age here, as she unconsciously thought that Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui were alone. "A pleasure to meet you all. My name is Yifang and this is my little daughter Xiang Feng." She quickly bowed and reintroduced their names. "Hello, Yifang. My name is Nangong Yi and this is my younger sister Nangong Lingxin." Nangong Yi nodded with a polite smile before looking with a gentle smile at the little girl. "Hey little beauty, how are you?" Xiang Feng seemed a bit shy as she immediately sought shelter behind her mother while looking at Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin with her head half hidden. Still, the girl seemed to be quite sensible as she said in a small gnat-like voice, "Hello big brother. Hello big sister. So cute." Nangong Lingxin seemed to be delighted with Xiang Feng. She made a sweet smile and as she waved her hand she offered, "Little Xiang Feng, do you want to take a nice shower with hot water? This big sister even has fruit and honey-scented soaps." Xiang Feng's eyes immediately lit up at the mention of shower and hot water as well as rich-smelling soaps. It had been a long time since she had last had the luxury of enjoying a comfortable shower since the wooden hut they lived in had only a straw bed and nothing else. She looked at her mother, who nodded with a small smile. "Go. Mama will soon join you too." Yifang looked at Nangong Lingxin with gratitude. Soon, Nangong Lingxin took Xiang Feng to the shower and not even 5 minutes later, the girl's giggles began to be heard all over the house. "Really? I don't know how to thank you enough." Yifang looked at Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui, who was now revealing her beauty in full, with eyes filled with gratitude. The life the mother and daughter pair led in comparison to the life they could now begin to enjoy was like wanting to compare the pure white clouds floating in the sky to the dirty mud that smudged the earth. Yifang knew that all this was given by the young man and the young woman in front of her. Bai Zemin sighed and shook his head, "You may soon no longer thank me. The peaceful life you want won't be possible. At least not yet. Not until I complete my goal. Yifang's heart tightened when she heard this. The amount of supplies Bai Zemin had were simply too much, and the beauty of Shangguan Bing Shui and the other woman inside this house was too dazzling. How could people like this live in this shanty town? They definitely had a hidden agenda. Although she already knew it in her heart, she still hoped that it was just an illusion of hers. Man Gongyi also frowned slightly. He looked at Bai Zemin cautiously, Just call me Bai Zemin or leader. We'll be fighting shoulder to shoulder for a long time. Bai Zemin interrupted and waved his hand lightly. Only those who do not know me or have no dealings with me should use that word. I see. Man Gongyi nodded and somehow felt that he was beginning to understand a little of the kind of person the young man in front of him was. Being a mature and straightforward man, Man Gongyi didn't beat around the bush, so, Bai Zemin. Don't you think that bringing two people with no power is a bit? Considering what we are going to do. Yifang stood to the side as she listened to the strange conversation between the two men. Leader? Fight shoulder to shoulder? What they were about to do. Suddenly, she realized that things were even more complicated than she originally estimated. Let's talk about it later. Bai Zemin looked at Yifang and said calmly, you should go with Nangong Lingxin and your daughter to take a shower. We can talk while we eat once you girls are done. That's fine. Yifang nodded knowingly, and while holding the clothes that Bai Zemin had bought for her, she retreated towards the bathroom. Once Yifang left, Man Gongyi's expression turned serious and whispered, you two noticed it too, didn't you? As if a little rat could sneak away from us. Bai Zemin smiled calmly and walked toward the kitchen. It's been following us ever since Bai Zemin showed how much stock he has. Shangguan Bing Shui replied as she looked outside the house as if she could see beyond the walls. Then, she smirked and followed Bai Zemin into the kitchen. Man Gongyi followed the two young people into the kitchen, and when he got there, he saw that the two had begun to busy themselves. While Bai Zemin was preparing the ingredients, Shangguan Bing Shui was cleaning the bowls and pots they had recently bought. Strangely or not, they seemed to be quite in sync with each other's every action without getting in the way of each other's movements. If Man Gongyi were a young man, he might even have thought that the two of them were actually a loving engaged couple. However, by carefully observing the look in Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui's eyes, Man Gongyi easily noticed that while they seemed to be in harmony, they both looked like having erected a barrier of indifference around themselves. Man Gongyi put aside the useless thoughts and asked with a frown, but there is something I don't understand. Why would you show the resources in public? As the leader of a camp with over 2,000 survivors, Bai Zemin not only needed to be strong but also needed to be someone smart. Otherwise, he would have died a long time ago. So, Man Gongyi could not understand how a smart person did such a foolish thing. In fact, from the first moment Bai Zemin revealed the contents of his bag to the first merchant when he bought clothes for Yifang and Xiang Feng, he noticed how a man dressed as a policeman followed them from afar. Although the man was well hidden among the people and followed them from a considerable distance, how could a normal human escape the senses of Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui, who had already taken the first step to leave their mortal shells? While putting a pot of hot water on the small gas furnace, Bai Zemin wiped his hands and calmly replied, we are moving in 2 days at most. What? Man Gongyi, who was resting with his back against the wall, jumped up from his position and even with his age couldn't help but exclaim loudly. Bai Zemin looked at Nan Gongyi and slowly began to narrate all the things they saw and experienced during the brief but at the same time heavy walk around the base. While washing the rice with her small hands, Shangguan Bing Shui listened to everything with apparent indifference, and it was hard to tell what her true thoughts were. I see. After hearing everything Bai Zemin said, Nan Gongyi sighed audibly. I had no idea. While my sister and I were here, we never saw the need to come to this area of the base, so we didn't know the situation was so bad. He shook his head lightly. Nan Gongyi really didn't know that the survivors were in such a miserable condition. Were it not for Bai Zemin telling him everything he saw today, and were it not for the fact that with his strength he didn't need to deceive him, Nan Gongyi wouldn't know any of this or would simply find it hard to believe unless he saw it with his own eyes. Then, Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bing Shui, who had already finished her task and was now looking at him, and calmly asked, "What do you think about it? Enough observation? Or are you still not satisfied?" Shangguan Bingshui looked him straight in the eyes without saying anything for a few seconds before finally looking out the broken window and said, "It's enough. The faster we put an end to these scum, the better. Happy that we think alike." Bai Zemin smiled slightly and walked out of the room as a chill flashed in his black as night eyes. In fact, Shangguan Bingshui was as much, if not more angry than Bai Zemin with the people in charge of this base. Even if they were short of rice, they would have to have plenty of meat to feed the survivors. Yanqing district was rich in forests and the number of beasts was plentiful. Even if they were difficult to hunt, just a couple of beasts could provide the base with tens of kilograms of meat, while the bigger ones could provide hundreds or even thousands. With the mutated meat, a soup could be made and distributed among the survivors. The amount of nutrition in this soup would undoubtedly be far greater than the gruel they were distributing to the survivors right now. Even if killing first-order beasts was difficult for the high leaders and soul evolvers of the North Camp, killing unclassified beasts should be a fairly simple matter. So why didn't they feed the survivors well? It was probably because they believed that all of them were not worth it. While Shangguan Bingshui might not be a saint and was quite cruel when the situation called for it, at least she had some human conscience in her being. This was precisely the source of her irritation. As for Bai Zemin, his thoughts were simpler than those of Shangguan Bingshui. He was irritated that helpless children had to suffer because of the cruelty of adults. So, since he was planning to wipe out the opposition and take complete control of this base anyway, why not speed up his plans a bit? In any case, Shangguan Bingshui was already disappointed with the government of this camp, so there was no need to delay any longer. If you have already made your decision, then there is nothing more to say. I will support you. Nan Gongyi nodded towards Bai Zemin as he walked beside him, to which he responded with a faint smile before leaving the kitchen. Before leaving, Nan Gongyi looked at Shangguan Bingshui and couldn't help but say, "You haven't noticed yet, em?" Shangguan Bingshui, who seemed lost in her own thoughts, frowned slightly and looked at him in confusion. Didn't she previously say that yes, she noticed the person who tracked them here before disappearing? Seeing this, Nan Gongyi sighed again and shook his head before walking away, leaving a few words behind. "If you haven't noticed yet, then it's okay. Although I'm afraid you'll regret it in the future, it's not my business to meddle in other people's business, let alone considering your higher position." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 246, Nan Gonglingxin's Admiration. Staring at Nan Gongyi's back until he disappeared into the corner of the corridor, Shangguan Bingshui frowned even more deeply and her eyes glittered with confusion. However, a split second later, her expression returned to normal as if it had never changed in the first place. Although she had no idea what Nan Gongyi was talking about, she believed that if she didn't know or if she didn't notice, it was because it wasn't an important matter to begin with. If it wasn't an important matter, then there was no need to worry or think about it too much. Besides, it could even be Nan Gongyi's idea and not something real. About an hour and a half later, the group that had previously consisted of 4 and was later joined by 2 more people, was gathered in what was supposed to be the living room. Because there was no furniture, the 6 of them were sitting cross-legged on the floor, forming a circle in the center. Inside the circle were some prepared dishes such as rice, meat sauce, meat and vegetable soup, fried meat and boiled meat, 4 tins of sardines, and more. Although the variety of the food was not much, since Bai Zemin's group originally only planned to attack this place and not stay here forever, it was undoubtedly quite a sumptuous meal, considering the current situation of the world. Even the high officials of the base could not necessarily afford to enjoy such dishes every day. Let alone considering that the meat that was in these dishes was not normal meat, it was meat from a mutated beast called Vicious Boar Level 15. Nan Gonglingxin picked up her chopsticks and while taking a small piece of vicious boar meat, she couldn't help but comment, although it's just a level 15 wild beast, its taste is top-notch. Indeed. Maybe only the meat of the first order reinforced iron boar is more delicious than this dude's meat. Bai Zemin recognized Nan Gonglingxin's words as he tasted the monster meat. Yifang's eyes were filled with tears. These tears represented all her grievances, pains, bitterness that she had to swallow forced by life, but at the same time they were tears filled with gratitude, gratitude for still being alive, gratitude towards the new opportunity granted to her and her daughter, gratitude towards the group of people next to her. Unconsciously, the woman looked at her daughter with eyes brimming with love. Xiang Feng's eyes, unlike her mother's emotional ones, shone like stars in the night sky. She looked at the bowl with rice and a thin strip of meat as if she wanted to devour the food with her gaze alone. Bai Zemin gave her a sidelong glance and felt really bad for this thin girl. To prevent Xiang Feng from having stomach problems, he limited the amount of food she could eat temporarily until her condition improved. However, he knew that probably in a day or two she would be back to her best condition or even beyond. After all, what Xiang Feng had in her bowl was not normal meat. Under her mother's loving eyes and by Zemin's curious stare, the 10-year-old girl took a small mouthful of meat to her lips before biting into it carefully with her pearly teeth. When the meat entered her mouth, the delicious juice was the first thing she savored before the meat practically melted away automatically from how tender it was. Xiang Feng swallowed the food in her mouth and immediately felt a rush of energy travel through her body before disappearing as if it had never happened in the first place. You have received health +5, stamina +2, strength +1. The chopsticks in Xiang Feng's hands trembled in sync with her body and her two little dark eyes widened as a strange message with green letters appeared in her retina. This was the second time she had seen something like this. The first time was a month ago when the soul record appeared on Earth. Feng? What's wrong? Are you all right? Yifeng misunderstood Xiang Feng's sudden behavior. Seeing her suddenly tremble fiercely and stagnate after tasting the meat in her bowl, the mother became so worried that she immediately put down her bowl on the floor and approached the girl. Xiang Feng seemed not to hear her mother and as if possessed by something, she took the strip of vicious boar meat with her chopsticks and began to devour it voraciously. You have received health +3, stamina +1, strength +1. You have received health +1, stamina +1. You have received health +1. After 4 bites, Xiang Feng stopped receiving those strange green messages. However, she continued to devour the meat as if her life depended on it. The strip of meat she had been given was not very large to begin with, so after a few small bites, the meat was completely gone. Seeing that there was no more meat in her bowl, Xiang Feng raised her little head and looked at Bai Zemin with the eyes of an intimidated puppy. The little girl was so smart that she clearly knew who was the person in charge here. Besides, she was clearly aware that Bai Zemin seemed to care for her quite a bit, so she unconsciously relaxed her guard against him. Don't look at me like that. Bai Zemin shook his head and said firmly, until tonight you can forget about eating any more of that meat. Your body is still weak and won't take it. Although Xiang Feng had gained a total of 10 health points, her body was not going to recover from malnutrition in the blink of an eye. It needed some time to adjust to the changes. It was similar to stamina. One could gain 100 stamina points, but if you were previously exhausted and almost unable to fight anymore, you would still feel exhausted even if you could continue to fight more thanks to the increased stat. Seeing her daughter Xiang Feng's attitude, Yifeng was very surprised. But what she was most curious about was the reason why her usually reasonable daughter was acting that way, so she also put a piece of meat in her mouth. You have received health +4, stamina +2, strength +1. Yifeng's eyes glittered with disbelief. She looked at the piece of meat in her bowl and muttered in shock, "What? How can this be possible?" She could clearly feel how her soul seemed to be purified and, as a consequence, her physical body improved. For her, whose natural stats were even below average, the improvement in stats she received was massive. Nangong Yi kindly explained, "The meat that you and little Xiang Feng ate is not normal meat. That meat came from a powerful beast capable of demolishing a small building with its physical body, and the soul power within it can improve the stats of those who are still relatively weak. Wasn't this meat a sacred treasure then?" Yifeng's eyes trembled at such a thought and realization. Unlike her innocent daughter, Yifeng was a grown woman capable of seeing beyond the question. Regardless of how tasty it was, a food capable of naturally enhancing physique, increasing stats, and bestowing power, it was undoubtedly a priceless treasure. How many top government officials would be willing to kill for the pleasure of not only enjoying a delicacy, but also becoming more powerful from the comfort of their homes? Yifeng was sure that a massacre could be unleashed at such a revelation. After all, in this world where death lurked in every shadow, one's stats represented power, and the more power, the greater the chances of survival in crisis situations. To say that the meat she was eating was an extra life insurance was not too much of an exaggeration. Yifeng simply could not accept such a precious food. She felt that eating it was a waste, considering that she was a useless woman incapable of doing anything. Before Yifeng could finish, Bai Zemin interrupted, "Just eat it. This kind of meat is no big deal, unlike what you think. In our camp, we have about 5 tons of meat that is a lot better in terms of value. In fact, what first order meat there was in beginning village was quite a bit. There was even some second order, though no one could eat it yet. Even Bai Zemin could only eat it carefully and in small quantities as the energy within it was too violent and brutish. Even more valuable than this meat?" Yifeng sucked in a breath of cold air. Moreover, she caught some words that caught her attention, "Our camp." "You mean?" Bai Zemin continued to eat calmly and began to explain who they were, where they came from, and the reason why they were here. He wasn't too worried about Yifeng betraying them, as she didn't seem to be the ungrateful type and still had to worry about the safety of her young daughter. But the real reason why he told her all this was because even if she betrayed them, at the end of the day, the end result would still be the same. When Bai Zemin finished explaining everything in a rather small summary, Yifeng was so shocked that she could not believe what she had heard. The young man who saved her and her daughter from despair was the absolute leader of a camp with over 2,000 survivors. In addition, there were about 300 armed men with military equipment. The beautiful silver-haired, blue-eyed young woman who looked like an ice fairy out of a fairy tale was actually the second most powerful person in the settlement, attacking and taking over this camp with only 4 people. Yifeng felt her head spinning in a spiral and her mind momentarily went blank. This all looked too crazy for her. She certainly never expected to meet such amazing people while begging in the dirty streets of the ghetto camp. She was not only shocked, but also scared. She only wanted a peaceful life for her daughter, but she had suddenly been caught up in a war between 2 strong factions and some warlords fighting for power. "Are you afraid?" Bai Zemin asked calmly. He looked at her for a moment and said composedly, "If you are afraid, I can give you and Xiang Feng enough rations to be able to live comfortably for 1 week. After that, you can look for a job by yourself, since by then this base will be under my control and many things will change." Nangong Lingxin, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Nangong Yi stopped their movements, looked at Yifeng, waiting to see what kind of answer this woman who had been fighting against destiny for the sake of her daughter for so long before finally collapsing in the face of the harshness and cruelty of the world. Yifeng bit her lower lip hard and hesitated. Just as her mind wandered all over the place, her daughter's sweet voice helped her decide. "Mom, it's okay." Xiang Feng put her small hand on her mother's and said with certainty, "Big brother is someone very powerful. Uncle is also very strong. And the 2 beautiful big sisters are also very strong." Nangong Yi was speechless. He was supposed to be the uncle? Although it was true that his age was old enough to be the little girl's uncle, but even so, they are very strong? Yifeng looked at her daughter with a look filled with confusion. Feng, how do you know that?" Xiang Feng looked with her big innocent eyes at Nangong Lingxin and said cheerfully, "Big sister Lingxin told me in the bath before you joined us. Big brother is so powerful that even an entire army was already annihilated by him with a single wave of his hands." Blood spears came raining down from the sky as if it was a punishment from the gods angry at the human evildoers. The earth shook in fear, and buildings collapsed one after another like sandcastles. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 247. I didn't like his voice and eyes, so I froze him to death. Cough. 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 Bai Zemin almost choked to death when Xiang Feng related what Nangong Lingxin told her while helping her shower earlier. The girl's voice was filled with adoration, and as she looked at him with her dark eyes, Bai Zemin somehow felt that he was a celebrity from the past in front of his biggest fan. Shangguan Bing Shui and Nangong Yi looked at Nangong Lingxin with raised eyebrows, to which the 27-year-old beauty responded with a faint blush and said in a whisper, "What? Didn't I tell the truth?" After saying those words, Nangong Lingxin looked at Bai Zemin out of the corner of her eye as if she feared that he was angry. However, Bai Zemin just looked at her, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, as he said, "I say, Nangong Lingxin, was it necessary to tell such things to a little child?" "Naturally it was necessary." Nangong Lingxin looked at him intently and replied earnestly, since you want to be the king of a new dynasty in the future, then the more people who know about your royal strength and miraculous feats, the better it will be for you and for all of us. Woman, you. Bai Zemin really didn't know what to say about it, so in the end, he ended up shaking his head with a complicated smile on his face. Shangguan Bingshue's lips curved slightly, and she looked at Nangong Lingxin with amusement. Could it be that you like a young man of 20 while you are 27? Nangong Lingxin simply shrugged her shoulders and said honestly, if it wasn't for the age difference, I'd be willing to pursue him and make him my man. I mean, why not? He's attractive, intelligent, extremely powerful, and not a psychopath. On the contrary, tell me if you've ever met a better man than him. Shangguan Bingshue opened her mouth to say something, but she was greatly surprised when she realized something. She had nothing to say about the last words of the woman in front of her. If it was before the apocalypse, then Bai Zemin didn't seem to have anything worth mentioning. However, as far as the current world was concerned, Shangguan Bingshui had yet to find a man with better overall qualifications than Bai Zemin. Even the handsome Chen He was far behind in many aspects, and only his appearance was better than Bai Zemin. In the end, she frowned and shook her head before continuing to enjoy her meal with no desire to continue chatting further. As he listened to his sister's words, Nangong Yi didn't know whether he should laugh or cry. Regardless of whether it was before the soul record came to Earth or after, his younger sister Nangong Lingxin was always an excellent woman in every aspect. Countless men strove daily to woo her, but she was like a proud swan who paid no attention to them at all. Yet, here she was, declaring that she would be willing to openly pursue a young college man while she had already entered the working world quite some time ago. How ironic. Nangong Yi thought before looking at Yifeng, who was looking at her daughter in a daze. Feng. Yifeng muttered in disbelief before forcing a smile and saying in a tone that suggested she was trying to convince herself of something, "Don't joke with Mom. How could such a powerful person exist? That's not something a human could possibly do. Hundreds of blood spears descending from the sky, buildings collapsing like weak sandcastles, the earth shook because of those attacks and everything was destroyed. An army was annihilated." Yifeng could not believe such a thing. Not because she didn't want to believe it, but because such things were too far from her imagination. From her point of view, only God could possess such power. But Big Sister said so. Xiang Feng did not seem to agree with her mother and refuted. Nangong Lingxin sighed softly and looked at Yifeng with a serious expression. "Aunt, although it may be hard to believe or imagine, everything I said is true. Bai Zemin is shockingly strong. This base will soon fall under his control, as there is no one here with the power to restrain him. Even one of the most powerful soul evolvers that protected one of the two highest leaders of this camp was destroyed with a single fist of his. I advise you to think carefully about what you will do next, or else you might lose the greatest opportunity of your life, just like it almost happened to my brother and me." Yifeng lowered her head and looked at the bowl of food in her hands with a blank stare. If everything her daughter and Nangong Lingxin said was true, then indeed, this could be the greatest opportunity of their lives. Being able to follow such a powerful person meant that the life she and her young daughter could live from now on would be brilliant, and their chances of survival would skyrocket through the roof with just one step. Even just being a maid in his house would be enough to live a pretty good life. But what if it was all a lie? Yifeng was so confused about what to do next that she had even gone through something that Bai Zemin and the rest had no reason to lie to her to begin with. She had nothing she could give them in any case. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that everyone present felt sympathy for sweet little Xiang Feng, they would never bother with giving explanations to a normal woman like her. Bang! While everyone was eating in silence, the front door was suddenly kicked open and a group of around 12 people charged into the house menacingly. Yifeng jumped in fear at the sudden loud sound. Her first action after recovering was to hug her daughter as she looked toward the entrance with wide eyes filled with fear. She and her daughter had personally seen how some people were killed just for a piece of bread. Now that a large group of people had entered the house, and considering that there were many more of them, and they all looked strong and powerful, the group of 6 consisting of 3 adult women, 1 little one, and 2 men, would definitely suffer a great loss. When the group of 12 saw the large amount of food and the still full backpacks on the side, they were so surprised that for a moment they froze. Moments later, everyone's eyes flashed and big smiles appeared on their faces. Damn. Look at all that food, ha ha ha. Those cops at least are good for something once in a while. Some of them started laughing out loud. It was as if they could already see all these supplies falling into their hands. On the other hand, the vast majority looked at the bodies and beautiful appearances of Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin. The naked lust in their eyes exposed the dirty thoughts crossing their minds. Hot. That woman has a nice pair of breasts, hee hee. I prefer the cool-looking girl. Those are the best in bed, ha ha ha. The feeling of conquering such a woman will definitely be great. It seemed that in their heads, the two women were already unclothed on the bed and they were having fun with them. The leader seemed to be a man in his 30s. His height was average, but his body was as sturdy as a tower. His head was completely shaved and there was a skull tattoo on his head and several other tattoos on his bare arms. But the most striking thing would be his eyes. His gaze looked like that of a venomous snake brimming with cruelty waiting to pounce on its prey. So far, the leader had not said a single word and just stood at the front as he looked at the group of people before him. I see there is a little girl here. So pretty. The bald-headed leader finally spoke. He looked at Xiang Feng with narrowed eyes and thereafter at Yifeng, who was hugging her protectively against her chest. If you don't want this little girl to see a little blood, how about we have a little chat? I'll ask the questions and you answer. Depending on whether I'm satisfied or not, I might let you go without hurting any of you. Bai Zemin gave him a sidelong glance before acting as if he wasn't there. He returned his focus to the bowl in his hands as he occasionally picked up a piece of meat and calmly put it in his mouth. Not only did Bai Zemin act indifferent, but Nangong Yi was also the same way. The only ones who were paying attention to the gang members were the four girls. Yifeng and Xiang Feng were in fear, while the other two were looking at them as if they were looking at 12 corpses instead of 12 people. All of you. You are courting death. Shangguan Bingshui's cold voice attracted the leader's attention. The bald man was surprised and startled to see the cold but deadly gaze of the woman in front of him. However, remembering his backup, he soon calmed down. A smirk appeared on his face as he said, "Courting death? I don't think so, little beauty. Anyway, who the hell are you and where did you get all this food from?" Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bingshui for a moment and calmly said, "Just freeze them all, but leave one behind. Don't stain the place with blood if possible. There's a little child here and I'm not sure she can bear to see a massacre the way Luo Ning did." Little Luo Ning fought against zombies every day and was extremely brave. She had even seen with her own eyes how some people died, but she did not seem too scared at such sights. However, Xiang Feng may not necessarily be as brave as Luo Ning even though she was 1 year older. Bai Zemin and the rest were still not too familiar with this girl, so they did not want to traumatize her for life. The bald leader looked at the young man who had just spoken with an amused smile. However, just as he was about to step forward to order his brothers to beat the loudmouth, the temperature inside the room suddenly plummeted. The bodies of all 12 men trembled with cold and nearly pissed their pants when they saw the beautiful silver-haired woman pointing a finger at them. Freeze. Swoosh. With a strong gale of extremely cold air, the bodies of 11 of the 12 men began to slowly freeze from their feet to their heads. They all screamed and struggled to move, but the frost that had stuck to their clothes quickly began to harden and grow until it reached a point where the lower half of their bodies were covered by a thick layer of ice. All those who looked at Shangguan Bingshui with lust and wished to possess her were within the group of 11. These men now looked at the ice with eyes filled with terror. The previous confidence and lust were nowhere to be seen, and what they wished most was to be able to turn back time so as not to provoke this woman. About 5 seconds later, the bodies of the 11 men had been sealed under the ice. Their terrified expressions had been frozen and immortalized in ice statues. Although from the outside their bodies were intact and without apparent wounds, the blood inside them had already frozen completely and their organs had stopped functioning. All of them were so dead that they could not die anymore even if they wanted to. Even the bald leader was among the 11 men who had been turned into ice statues, frozen to death. Bai Zemin looked at the skinny young man holding a watermelon cutting knife with trembling hands and then looked at Shangguan Bingshui helplessly. "You should have saved the leader. That bald guy maybe knew more than the rest." She shrugged and said calmly, "You never pointed out which one." I didn't like his voice and eyes, so I froze him to death. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 248 Shangguan Bing Shue's Hidden Talent. While looking at the 11 statues frozen in ice, Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bing Shue and said in exasperation, "You should have saved the leader. That bald guy maybe knew more than the rest." She shrugged and said calmly, "You never pointed out which one." "I didn't like his voice and eyes, so I froze him to death." The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth twitched a couple of times when he heard this kind of reply. If it was in the past, when the two of them had just met, he would no doubt have been angry with her. But after experiencing so much together, after so many life and death battles where they both supported each other and had each other's backs, something so insignificant couldn't make him start fighting with her. Seeing his speechless expression, Shangguan Bing Shue couldn't help but let a slightly teasing smile appear on her face. "Next time you need to be clearer about what you want." Even she was the same way. She was gradually beginning to smile more regularly, her words were softer, and her attitude when she talked with him was no longer so stiff. At the very least, it was obvious that she unconsciously felt more comfortable than in the past when all the two of them did was argue over anything they disagreed on. Bai Zemin was a little surprised by her smile, but soon couldn't help but shake his head when he heard her words. He really wanted to cry but had no tears to shed. Even though he knew she did it on purpose, the loss wasn't great in any case. Forget it. He waved his hand and said calmly, "Just make sure you get all the information you can from that scum." Then, under everyone's gaze, he went back to eating as if nothing had happened. "Whoa. Big sister, you are so powerful." Xiang Feng looked at Shangguan Bing Shue with starry eyes. Every time she looked at the ice statues, she seemed enchanted by the appearance of the 11 lost lives, as if instead of death each statue represented something incredible and wonderful. Nangong-yi whispered softly, his tone of voice was quite strange as was his expression. Could it be that all the little children are so impressive? He naturally knew Luo Ning, the 9-year-old little girl who not only wielded a sharp bone sword forged by Bai Zemin, but was also able to summon a strange creature that had the ability to mingle with the surrounding shadows. Luo Ning killed zombies and other mutant beasts when they appeared as if she was playing dolls. Now, Xiang Feng was delighted rather than frightened at the death of 11 people. Even if the way they died was not horrifying thanks to Shangguan Bing Shue's skill, death was death after all. Perhaps, as immature children, it's easier for them to adapt to the world and accept the new rules of the jungle more easily than it is for us adults. Nangong Lingxin sighed gently and looked at Xiang Feng with a complicated smile. Although it was good for this little girl to grasp the reality sooner rather than later, as this would give her a better life and higher her chances of survival in this chaotic world, it still left a somewhat bitter taste in her mouth. At the age of 10, Xiang Feng was supposed to be enjoying a warm home, the loving embrace of her mother and father, a beautiful school life, and she was supposed to be surrounded by a lot of young children her age, making many friends. However, she was not only on the verge of starving to death or becoming some pervert's plaything, but was currently being held by her mother for fear that something bad would happen to her in the next instant. At the age of 9, Luo Ning was supposed to be playing with her toys or having fun with her friends instead of wielding a sword and wearing leather armor to fight against dangerous and horrific creatures while fighting shoulder to shoulder with grown men and military soldiers. "I think I finally understand a little bit why you are so kind to this girl and why you acted that way with Luo Ning in the meeting room 2 days ago." Nangong Lingxin looked at Bai Zemin in a new light. Who would have thought that this indifferent and seemingly cruel young man who had killed several dozen people 2 days ago with a single wave of his hands and who had ordered the death of nearly a dozen more a minute ago would actually have such a kind part inside him as well? Bai Zemin looked at her for a second before shrugging casually. He didn't care too much about what other people say about him, he just needed to do what he believed was right. So that even in the face of death he would feel no regrets. Meanwhile, Yifang looked at Shangguan Bing Shue with her eyes wide open. Her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be struggling to gallop out of her chest, showing how agitated her emotions were at this moment. Not even in her wildest thoughts had Yifang believed that the silver-haired, blue-eyed fairy-like woman she met in her lowest moment of life would actually be so strong. Yifang was, after all, just an ordinary woman and the lowest caste among the survivors of the North Camp. The most powerful person she had ever seen was her deceased husband, who after reaching level 5 and receiving a skill scroll was able to wield a heavy iron pipe with one hand as if he was holding a small wooden stick. As for skills like Shangguan Bingshue's, this was the first time she had witnessed something like this. Shangguan Bingshue only said a single word and 11 people lost their lives and turned into ice statues. From Yifeng's point of view, Shangguan Bingshue could not be considered human. Wait. She is not the leader. The leader is he? Yifeng seemed to realize something and quickly looked at Bai Zemin, only to see that he seemed oblivious to the whole situation and continued to eat like a hungry ghost. Only now she remembered her daughter's words. Words she previously could not believe. If everything Nangong Lingxin told her daughter was real, then Yifeng suddenly realized that the group of people in front of her was too mysterious and much more terrifying than she initially imagined. Suddenly, she felt that this base would become agitated soon. As for Shangguan Bingshue, after finishing lightly joking with Bai Zemin, she looked at the only survivor of the 12 hooligans who had arrived with evil intentions. But unlike the indifferent but somewhat playful look she had when talking with Bai Zemin, the gaze she gave to the slender hooligan was the indifferent kind that sent a chill down one's spine. Talk or die. She only uttered 3 words. Nangongyi looked at her dumbfounded. Is this how you interrogate someone? That was what he was thinking. However, what happened next stupefied him even more. Clang. The watermelon cutting knife in the slender punk's hands fell to the floor because he couldn't keep a firm grip on it. His legs weakened and quivered like jelly at the same time as his face turned pale. The man seemed to be fighting against his own body not to pee himself. Just 3 words were enough for any will or courage to be destroyed. After all, he had just recently seen his companion slaughtered by the cold woman before him. Even now he could feel the coldness of the ice statues standing beside him. I will tell you. I'll tell you everything I know, so please spare my life. The slender punk sobbed and began to spill all the beans on the table without even missing a single word. Nangongyi almost spat the food out of his mouth. Really? Did it work? No torture and no beating? He thought dumbfounded and suddenly realized that Shangguan Bingshue had a talent for this kind of business. While some were indifferent, while some were shocked, while some were dumbfounded, while some were casual, while some were delighted, the hooligan narrated the whole situation and the reason why they found out about the group. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 249 3 verses hundreds, Part 1. Southeast Zone of the North Camp. The East Zone of the North Camp was the opposite of the West Zone. The West Zone was where the most powerless survivors resided. This part of the base was composed of the lowest caste of survivors, the lowest members of the social and food pyramid. The people who lived here suffered from hunger and had to use all kinds of acts to get a glimmer of hope to see the next day's sun rise over the horizon. On the other hand, the Eastern Zone was where all those with certain power resided. This part of the base was composed of high government officials chosen by Kong Rong and Lu Yen, the highest leaders. In addition to members of the government or police officers with some leadership and power among the troops, there were also the powerful soul evolvers and their families. People living in the East Zone enjoyed the highest possible treatment, they ate the best food, drank the best wine, enjoyed the best beauties, and practically had the right to do almost anything as long as it did not affect the interests of another person with power or the base in general. If the West Zone was hell, then the East Zone was undoubtedly heaven, a heaven that normal survivors could never access and could only dream about while looking at it from so close but at the same time from so far away. Although a month had passed since the outbreak of the apocalypse, the electric light was still functioning properly. Although the power plants needed human labor to operate, it would take some time before the large generators would stop working. It was thanks to this that mankind could still make use of artificial light to illuminate the dark night world every time the sun went below the horizon. Inside one of the most luxurious villas in the east, the lighting was bright, and from the outside, this 3-story building looked like a small starry sky by itself. In a very spacious and sumptuously decorated dining room, the sound of clanking cooking utensils was the only sound that could be heard. 6 beautiful women dressed in French-made uniforms stood in 2 rows of 3 on both sides of the large oak table. The ages of the women varied. There were teenagers, there were young adults, there were mature women, there was even one who was well past middle age, but clearly kept in condition, and except for slight wrinkles at the corner of her eyes, her beauty was intact. Petite bodies, curvaceous bodies, explosive bodies, innocent faces, cold faces, kind faces, charming faces, etc. All 6 women enjoyed their own styles, but they were all naturally beautiful. They were definitely among the most beautiful in the base. It was precisely for this reason that they managed to work in a place like this, despite not having any backup or strength to lean on. The 6 women looked at the dishes on the table with some desire in their eyes. Although they were better off than most of the survivors at the base, enjoying meals like the ones they were looking at right now was absolutely impossible. There was fried rice, rice with soy sauce, baked chicken, mutant beast meat, smoked fish, even 2 large bottles of Sprite and Coke. Except for the mutant beast meat, such foods might have been relatively normal in the past. However, after the appearance of the Soul Record on Earth and the fall of society, such meals were luxuries that few could afford to enjoy. Sitting at the head seat of the table, a man of about 50 years old moved his hand slowly. Sometimes he would take a piece of meat and tasting it, other times he would chew some chicken to vary the flavors. When he felt thirsty, he would take some soda. He seemed worry-free. The man was not too tall, but he could not be considered small either. He was about 1.73 meters tall. However, his slightly bulging belly and chubby face gave him a rather funny appearance along with his sparse hair that had practically disappeared completely. However, no one in the entire base dared to laugh at this man's appearance. Because he was Kong Rong, one of the 2 biggest fish in this base. With over 300 armed men under his command and approximately 90 soul evolvers, anyone who had offended him in the past had long since disappeared from this world. Although Kong Rong looked leisurely and carefree, the 6 beautiful women could see a slight frown on his face that betrayed his inner thoughts, not as calm as he appeared on the surface. As Kong Rong enjoyed his dinner in silence, a police officer approached with cautious steps. The man's eyes occasionally glanced at the 6 beautiful women as even for him, who had a certain position on the base, it was rare to be able to see such beauties. Chief Kong. The police officer stopped 2 meters from the table and respectfully bowed to the seated man. Kong Rong raised his head slightly and pointed to the table. Shanli, sit down and eat something. Shanli said nothing and sat down silently. Under his calculating gaze, 2 maids began to serve plates of food for him while another hurried to the kitchen in search of utensils and an extra glass. Meanwhile, Kong Rong asked in a deep voice, "Still no news of that brat son of mine?" Shanli's expression changed slightly. "Still," he said honestly, "we haven't received even a single transmission from your son yet, Chief Kong." The maidens' bodies tensed and they looked at Kong Rong warily. Although Kong Rong's son was a pervert who caused a lot of trouble, no matter what, he was still his son. Although Kong Rong did not approve the lust and pervert that his son Kong Hong was, blood was thicker than water after all. Kong Hong had left in a southerly direction about 5 days ago to pursue a woman, but had not yet returned. Although Kong Rong knew that his son was quite powerful and had a team of several soul evolvers with him, something inside him told him that the situation might not be as good as he had thought. That was precisely why he sent a team with 2 of his most powerful evolvers to look for his son, since all communications had been cut off several days ago. Kong Rong kept an impassive expression on his face and after drinking some juice, continued, "What about Wang Zedong and Dai Yun's group? Any news from them?" This. Shanli put on a complicated expression and hesitated. Soon, however, he gritted his teeth and said, "Chief Kong, the truth is that Mr. Wang and Miss Dai's squad has not contacted the base again as you ordered." Kong Rong's expression turned extremely ugly when he heard this and his eyes flashed with viciousness and murderous intent. Wang Zedong was a dangerous ex-convict, and to deal with him, Kong Rong had no choice but to plant several intelligent bombs inside his body using the help of an evolver with the skill of closing flesh wounds. Even so, it was not easy for Kong Rong to control him, and that was why he sent one of the most reliable people under his command, Dai Yun. Although Dai Yun could not defeat Wang Zedong, if she wanted to run away he could not stop her thanks to the set of skills she possessed that were in sync with each other. If Dai Yun informed him about any suspicious movement of Wang Zedong, Kong Rong could send him to oblivion as long as he did not go more than 5,000 kilometers away. Dai Yun betrayed me? Kong Rong could not help but think of such a possibility. However, he soon dismissed the thought. Dai Yun had a brother who depended on her since he was useless. She would definitely not do something stupid that could put her family's life at risk like betraying him. At that moment, Shan Li's voice sounded inside the dining hall again, Chief Kong. Forgive my boldness, but what if your son and Mr. Wang's team met some powerful monster on the way, or perhaps an enemy beyond their capabilities? Kong Rong's face changed again and he began to tap his finger on the table as he plunged into his thoughts. What Shan Li had just brought up was not something Kong Rong had not thought of. It was just that such a thought was difficult for him to accept. Kong Rong had personally seen Wang Zedong fight to the death and emerge victorious against a huge 7-meter-tall bull. That bull looked like a prehistoric creature and its meat was so precious that even an ordinary person like him could receive benefits from eating it. To Kong Rong, who had only seen normal zombies, mutated zombies, and some wild beasts, that bull was a formidable enemy. He simply couldn't imagine anything beyond that. That's impossible. Kong Rong shook his head after a moment of silence. Even if Wang Zedong and Dai Yun's team met with heavy trouble, they should have at least been able to send a message. I refuse to believe that a group of over 50 armed men and 2 powerful warriors could be wiped off the face of the earth in less than a minute. Seeing that Kong Rong had spoken, and listening to his reasoning, Shan Li felt that what he said makes sense. Although Kong Rong was a rather arrogant person, as a leader he was not too bad compared to people like Yi Qigong and the other 3 previous village chiefs that Bai Zemin currently controlled. Kong Rong was quite smart and could make the best of the situation depending on his own strength. It was precisely because of this that despite being a coward who did not dare to kill zombies, he still managed to firmly control his troops. Chief Kong, actually, I came here for another matter. Shan Li changed the topic when he saw that the previous one was over. A slight trace of concern appeared on his face as he said, actually, a group of suspicious people dash. Bang. 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 The sound of gunshots coming from outside abruptly echoed in the middle of the night and Shan Li's next words stuck in his throat. The 6 beautiful women were a little frightened at first, but after remembering the safety of this villa, they calmed down again, although there was still some worry in their eyes. What the hell is going on? Kong Rong stood up abruptly. His eyes filled with anger as he said, that old bastard Lu Yen finally couldn't take it anymore and came looking for problems? It seems that until I chop his head off and turn that little bitch of a daughter he has into a prostitute, he won't be happy. Kong Rong was not afraid. His villa was guarded by 150 well-armed men and 20 powerful soul evolvers. This kind of force was enough to resist an enemy assault for at least 1 full hour, enough time for the rest of his forces to catch up to suppress or repel Lu Yan's forces. On the other hand, it was Shan Li who felt a bad premonition. He felt that this night attack was not necessarily related to Lu Yan, but to the strange group of people who had appeared out of nowhere at the base earlier today. In fact, when one of his trusted subordinates informed him about a group of people living in the western part of the base controlling a large amount of food, Shan Li pulled some strings from the shadows to get information. Unfortunately, things turned out much worse than he initially thought. This was the real reason for his visit today. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 253 vs. Hundreds, Part 2. A few hours before Kong Rong's villa was attacked, west side of North Camp. Inside the 2-story building where Bai Zemin's group temporarily resided, 6 people looked at the 12 ice statues with different emotions. I wonder if this guy would have spoken if he knew that, at the end of the day, he would end up becoming an ice cube anyway. Nangong-yi looked at the slender punk's terrified face and analyzed indifferently. Regardless of that, this kind of trash is better off in the netherworld than in this world. Nangong Lingxin mocked mercilessly. This punk didn't have the courage to go out and kill zombies, but he has the courage to bully those weaker ones and make the already difficult life of the survivors even more miserable. Each person harvests what they sowed, and this guy has only just gathered what he himself planted. In fact, the slender punk was frozen to death by Shangguan Bing Shui after he finished telling everything he knew in the hope that they would let him go. Some people may think that such an act was cruel, unfair, or treacherous, but from the point of view of Xietain and the rest, what they did was to take out the trash. The world was already in such a precarious situation, and humanity could be annihilated if they made a single misstep. Still, there were people who, instead of thinking or fighting the real enemy, wasted their time bullying and intimidating those who had no power. Who knows how many people were harmed by these people? Who knows how many died or how many women were abused by this kind of scum? Nangong Yi, Nangong Lingxin, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Xietain did not feel any compassion for such monstrosity. Yifeng looked at the 12 ice statues with an extremely complicated expression. Although she had seen people die in front of her eyes several times, death was something she simply could not get used to, and preferred never to do so. She felt that she might lose her humanity if such a thing ever happened. As for Xiang Feng, she did not look scared at all. On the contrary, she looked at Shangguan Bing Shui as if she were her new idol and occasionally asked her a question or two. The naive girl would sometimes even point her little finger and try to imitate Shangguan Bing Shui as if she wanted to throw gusts of icy wind. In the end, everything turned out as we expected. Xietain looked at Shangguan Bing Shui and shrugged his shoulders. Right. She nodded in agreement. In fact, the appearance of the 12 threatening hooligans happened because the police officer who had followed them here took the liberty of having a chat with one of the local gangs to study the situation. In the North Camp, there were many gangs, and among these gangs, a few were secretly supported by members of the government or people with certain acquisitive power. By using these gangs, they were able to profit from the bad part of the base as well as profit from the good part. This was precisely why that police officer did not dare to make a big move, and it was also why the 12 hooligans did not do anything too drastic to prevent their gang from getting into big problems with a powerful person. Unfortunately for these people, the group of 12 hooligans, who were meant to be scouts, were eliminated even before they could properly introduce themselves. As for what kind of reaction the base would have, Xietain had no way of knowing since each mind was a world apart. However, it is safe to assume that this will not end here. Xietain took a step forward and approached the statues as he calmly said, "I guess we'll have to speed things up." After all, he didn't like problems that could be avoided before they happened. Under everyone's gaze, Xietain clenched his right fist slightly and casually punched forward. Bang! A mighty air bullet formed as a result of the power behind his casual fist, and the 12 statues were turned into ice dust. They simply disappeared completely, leaving nothing but fine, tiny fragments of frost that were soon swept away by the wind blowing in through the broken windows. Those survivors who were outside the building had naturally seen the 12 hooligans walking in. They all believed that the people inside would definitely meet a miserable fate, and some survivors even secretly gloated over the misfortunes of others. However, even after a long time, no sound could be heard. The bang and the shaking of the house frightened those curious onlookers who lurked nearby, causing them to flee into the distance, while some yelled in terror believing that someone had fired a gun. None of them wanted to die, so they wisely fled when they realized that if they died here, they had only themselves to blame for their stupidity. It was clear to these survivors that even if they died, they would not make big waves as they were of no importance to the high officials at the base. Unconsciously, Yifeng swallowed deeply as she looked at the apparently thin young man in front of her. A single casual fist, and clearly without too much effort to launch it, was enough to turn 12 magic ice statues into a pile of dust. Even the bodies and blood were nowhere to be seen. Of course, the blood, flesh, and the entire body was already frozen in ice. Otherwise, no matter how strong Xietain was, it was impossible for him to make a corpse disappear without a trace. Soon, time flew by, and a few hours later darkness descended. At night used to be the most dangerous time in the apocalypse. There were many reasons, but the main one was that while humans could not see more than a couple of meters ahead, zombies were guided by a sense other than sight to reach their prey, while mutated beasts with a great sense of smelling could smell flesh from vast distances. Even powerful soul evolvers had their senses incredibly limited in the middle of the night, let alone normal people. While everyone was inside their homes with the doors firmly closed and the lights turned off to avoid attracting the attention of any wild beasts, a svelte silhouette crept through the night like a shadow. One moment it was in one place, but the next instant its body disappeared only to appear several yards away before vanishing again. The small silhouette charged towards the west side of the base without alerting anyone. In a matter of minutes, it had traveled several kilometers, crossed several streets, alleys, jumped over the roofs of some houses, and without anyone noticing, slipped into this dangerous area where the life and death of survivors occurred more often than it really seemed. Soon, the small silhouette reached a two-story building and paused momentarily outside to scan the surroundings before slipping into the courtyard as its body seemed to blend into the environment, and its presence seemed to disappear completely. Even if a survivor stood a step away, they would not be able to notice it. The courtyard that the small and svelte silhouette sneaked into was the courtyard where Zeman's group currently resided.